We're continuing to analyze the Alec Baldwin Rust movie shooting case and continuing to respond to law of self-defense here. Okay, so we're looking at what Branca says are the three things that the prosecution has to prove. They only have to prove three things. They have to prove that he pointed the muzzle in the direction of the victim, Helena Hutchins, okay? That he pressed the trigger and that he failed to ensure that the weapon did not contain live ammo. And that if the prosecution can prove these three things, and without a doubt, Alec Baldwin is guilty of involuntary manslaughter. Now, I would take issue with this analysis. I would submit that, and this essentially is the same thing the prosecution's doing too, and what they put in the jury instructions for the grand jury. I mean, this is the core of the prosecution's case too, even in their public statements where they said he didn't verify the gun, he pointed it and he pulled the trigger. Okay, so it's like not verifying plus pointing plus pulling the trigger is what adds up to the negligence or without due caution circumspection. Okay, so I would submit that these three elements are simultaneously too much and not enough to establish involuntary manslaughter. They're too much because consider the armorer, Hannah Gutierrez Reed. She didn't have the gun in her hand, according to, let's go back to Steve V. Gilliam too, right? All that is necessary to establish involuntary use of manslaughter by use of a loaded weapon is that the defendant had in his hands a gun. Okay? Hannah Gutierrez Reed was convicted of involuntary manslaughter, and she didn't have the gun in her hand, so this first point is not necessary and not necessarily enough. The second point, Hannah Gutierrez, that he pressed the trigger. Hannah Gutierrez Reed didn't pull the trigger, so once again, it's not enough, or it's insufficient. And you could argue that the armorer, she did fail to ensure that the weapon didn't contain live round. I mean, she tried to. In her mind, she did verify the gun. I mean, she did it improperly, okay, but she at least attempted to do it. She pulled that dummy round out of a box that was labeled dummies, and in her mind that was good enough to think it was a dummy round and put it in the gun. So in her mind, she verified it. So maybe you could take issue with this third thing. But anyways, the point is that Hannah Gutierrez Reed did at most one, arguably one out of the three, and she still got convicted. So that's why it's too much. Imagine that the prosecution couldn't actually prove that Alec Baldwin didn't check the gun. Like, what if Alec Baldwin said he checked the gun before anybody walked into the church, and defense or the prosecution couldn't really prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Alec Baldwin didn't check the gun? You think they'd just give up and it's like, oh, okay, well, now we can't prove our case? No, they would just say, well, that's not necessary. This is a non-essential element, back to Steve V. Gilliam, which we've done 2 videos on now. It's a non-essential element. We don't need to prove that Alec Baldwin didn't verify the gun. See, so it's only the facts that can be established that now all of a sudden become the crux of the case. But if they weren't there, then they would just make a different argument. All right, and then at the same time, these 3 things are not enough because these things do not necessarily add up to what's required for involuntary manslaughter. Let's look at the involuntary manslaughter statute. Here we go. So there's 2 counts. Alec Baldwin's charged with both alternatives. One is that he had, involuntary manslaughter either in the commission of an unlawful act not amounting to a felony, that's alternative count 1 that Alec Baldwin is charged with, or in the commission of a lawful act which might produce death in an unlawful manner without due caution or circumspection. So in the case of the first count, the underlying act, the underlying illegal act, is negligent use of a firearm or a deadly weapon. Okay, what's that? So let's go look at that. All right, and the negligent use of a deadly weapon, the state would have to prove this, that Alec Baldwin was handling the gun negligently. Well, if you read this, the only thing that really applies is number 3 here, endangering the safety of another by handling or using a firearm or deadly weapon in a negligent manner. Oh, that's really great. So the definition of a negligent use of a deadly weapon is to use a deadly weapon in a negligent manner. I mean, it's circular. Like, how does that help us? Right, so then you got to say, okay, well, what's the definition of negligent? And if you come down here, there is some case law. Now, this is kind of where case law can be used and given in the jury instruction as to, well, how do we interpret the word negligent? That's when case law can actually be useful and might make its way into the jury instruction or something like that. Not the way Bronco's been using it to say that State v. Gilliam said 70 years ago that it can never matter who loaded the gun. That's not the way case law is applied. But here, in terms of trying to get to the bottom of what is the definition of a term, case law could be useful for that. But anyways, negligent means omitting to do something which a reasonable man, guided by those considerations which ordinarily regulate the conduct of human affairs, that's kind of the key, would do, or not doing something that a prudent, reasonable man would do. So it's either doing something normal man wouldn't do, or not doing something normal man would do. So the prosecution would have to prove that. If they're going to go with this first alternative count, meaning that Alec Baldwin was actually committing an illegal act through negligent use of a firearm, and then out of that illegal act came the second part of it where someone died. So they would have to prove this negligence, right? And the negligence would have to be proven kind of by the standard of, guided by those considerations which ordinarily regulate the conduct of human affairs. Not that, negligence equals not verifying plus pointing plus pulling. Like, there's nothing in the statute anywhere that says that. It's really a jury that has to look at the totality of the situation and decide whether that, comports with their understanding of negligence or not. And then if it's the second alternative, so the second part of this, which is he's charged with both counts, okay, so it's one alternative or the other. The jury does not have to agree on, if half the jury thinks it's one and half the jury thinks it's the other, it doesn't matter. Then it's a guilty. So they don't have to unanimously agree on which act it is, whether it's the first part or the second part. But anyways, the second part is this without due caution or circumspection, which is almost the same thing. So the state's got to prove either negligence or without due caution or circumspection, some combination thereof. That's what they have to prove. They don't have to prove any of these things, right? They don't have to prove that he pointed or didn't verify or that he pulled the trigger. And on the opposite side of that, even if they can prove that, that's not enough to prove the negligence or the without due caution or circumspection. Bronco, of course, thinks that this is a complete open and shut case, that basically Alec Baldwin's cooked, that there's no plausible defense for this at all, that it was on a movie set or anything, and he wasn't the one that loaded the gun. None of that matters, because of State v. Gilliam, which he loves to quote, that 70 years ago, the Supreme Court said that it can never matter who loaded the gun. It's right there, right? It doesn't matter who loaded the gun, even though that's not what they were talking about. So he, of course, gives no credence at all to this line of argumentation. It said that this is the only three things that the state's got to prove, and they obviously can prove that, and therefore Alec Baldwin is without doubt guilty of involuntary manslaughter. So I disagree with that analysis for the reasons I just said, that it's simultaneously, these three things are simultaneously too much and not enough all at the same time.